Hey, Stoic warriors, you're not who you think you are. You're who your habits, fears, reactions, and repeated choices have trained you to become. The identity you defend so confidently may only be a mask built from other people's expectations, past failures, and survival patterns you never questioned. Most people spend their entire lives protecting a version of themselves that was created out of fear, comfort, and approval, not truth. Stoicism forces you to confront something deeper. If you can observe your thoughts, your emotions, and your impulses, then you are not them. And the moment you realize that, everything changes, because now you can rebuild yourself consciously instead of living as a prisoner of a personality you never intentionally created. Here's what nobody tells you. The version of you that wakes up every morning, scrolls through a phone, avoids certain conversations, shrinks in certain rooms, overreacts to certain words, that version wasn't born. It was constructed, piece by piece, year by year. Built from the first time someone laughed at your idea. Built from the first time you were told you were too much or not enough. Built from the nights you stayed quiet when you should have spoken, and the moments you performed confidence when you felt none. You didn't choose that construction. You survived it, and then you mistook survival for identity. Epictetus, a man who was born into slavery, beaten, broken in body, stripped of every external freedom a human being can possess, said something that should stop you completely. Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things. He wasn't talking about positive thinking. He was exposing something far more dangerous. He was saying that the story you carry about yourself, the one you repeat internally every single day, is not reality. It is an opinion. And opinions can be wrong, even the ones you've held about yourself for 20 years. Most people never question the narrator inside their own head. They assume that because a thought feels familiar, it must be true. They assume that because a pattern is old, it must be permanent. They assume that because they've always been this way, they were born this way. But familiar is not the same as true. Old is not the same as fixed. And the person you've always been is not the person you are required to remain. The most devastating thing happening to people right now isn't failure. It isn't loss. It's that millions of human beings are living with absolute certainty inside an identity that was handed to them by circumstances they never chose. And they are defending it, protecting it, fighting for the right to remain exactly who their pain taught them to be. That ends today, not with motivation, not with a list of habits, but with a complete psychological demolition of the false self you've been carrying, and a return to something that was always underneath it. Type this in the comments. I am not my past. Now let's get into it. Point 1. You were shaped by survival, not by choice. Every single pattern you have right now, the way you go silent when someone raises their voice, the way you over-explain yourself in conversations, the way you say yes when your entire body is screaming no, the way you shrink in rooms where you should be standing tall. None of that is personality. That is protection. That is a nervous system that learned at some point in your life that being yourself was dangerous. And so it adapted, it armored up, it created responses, reflexes, and roles that kept you safe in environments that weren't safe. The problem is, you're still wearing that armor in rooms that no longer require it. Psychologists call it a conditioned response. Stoics call it living without reason. But you've been calling it your personality. You've been calling it just who I am. You've been introducing a defense mechanism as if it were a soul. The child who grew up walking on eggshells becomes the adult who cannot handle conflict without shutting down completely. The teenager who was mocked for expressing emotion becomes the adult who performs strength so convincingly they've forgotten what genuine feeling even looks like. The person who was abandoned becomes the adult who abandons others first, not out of cruelty, but out of a survival script that says leave before you're left. You didn't write those scripts. Pain wrote them. Fear wrote them. And you inherited them without a single signature. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." What he understood, what most people miss entirely, is that the obstacles that shaped you were not your destiny. They were your training ground. The suffering wasn't supposed to become your identity. It was supposed to build your capacity. But somewhere along the way, you confused the fire with the ash. You kept the wounds and forgot the warrior who survived them. You are not your coping mechanisms. You are not your defense patterns. You are not the role you were forced to play in a family system that needed you to be small so others could feel large. You are the consciousness that can now look at all of that clearly and choose differently. That choice, right there, that is freedom. Point 2. The opinions you believe about yourself were never yours. Someone told you that you were too sensitive, and you believed them. Someone told you that you weren't smart enough, disciplined enough, attractive enough, capable enough, and you didn't just hear it, you absorbed it. You took it in like oxygen and let it circulate through every decision you made from that moment forward. You started filtering opportunities through it, filtering relationships through it, filtering your own reflection through it. And the voice that delivered that verdict? It's probably been dead for years, or completely wrong, or so broken themselves they had no business measuring anyone else's worth. But their words are still running your life. This is the quiet devastation that nobody talks about. Not the loud trauma, not the visible wounds, but the opinions, casually delivered, sometimes even with love, that rewired the way you see yourself permanently. A parent who said you were dramatic, a teacher who said you weren't academic, a relationship that made you feel invisible so consistently that invisibility started to feel like your natural state. These were never facts. They were projections. They were the limitations of people who could not see beyond their own limitations, and you made them your gospel. Epictetus understood this with a clarity that cuts through centuries. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. But before the reaction, there is the interpretation, and your interpretation of yourself has been contaminated by voices that had no authority over your actual worth. You've been reacting to a version of yourself that someone else invented. The most radical act you can perform right now is not changing your habits or your routine. It is sitting in complete stillness and asking yourself, which of these beliefs about myself did I actually choose? Which ones did I arrive at through real self-examination? And which ones were simply repeated to me so many times by so many people in so many moments of vulnerability that I eventually stopped questioning them and started living inside them? Because the moment you separate inherited opinion from actual truth, the moment you hold up every belief about yourself to genuine examination, most of them will not survive the light. Most of them were never built to. They were built to keep you manageable, not to keep you whole. Point 3. Your emotions are information, not identity. You got angry once and someone said, "That's just who you are. You have anger issues." You cried in a moment of genuine pain and someone labeled you weak, fragile, too emotional. You felt fear before something new and unfamiliar, and you interpreted that fear as a sign that you weren't built for it. And slowly, over time, you started mapping your emotions directly onto your identity, as if a feeling that passed through you for 30 seconds was somehow a permanent statement about your character. As if the weather was the same thing as the sky. Your emotions are not you. They are data. They are your nervous system communicating something real about what is happening inside and around you. Anger is telling you that a boundary was crossed. Fear is telling you that something unfamiliar is approaching. Sadness is telling you that something mattered. These are not character flaws. These are signals. And the Stoics understood this at a depth that modern psychology is only now beginning to catch up with. Seneca wrote something that deserves to be read slowly. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. What he was pointing at was the gap, the devastating, life-altering gap between what an emotion actually is and the story you layer on top of it the moment it arrives. The emotion lasts seconds. The story you build around it lasts decades. You didn't ruin your life by feeling things. You narrowed your life by deciding that what you felt defined what you were. The person who has never learned to separate observation from identification will spend their entire life being dragged by their own interior weather. One difficult conversation, and their entire self-image collapses. One rejection, and suddenly every belief they held about their worth is on trial. One failure, and the verdict becomes permanent. This is not emotional depth. This is emotional imprisonment, and the key out of that prison is the most stoic skill that exists, the ability to witness your own internal state without becoming it. You can feel rage and still respond with precision. You can feel devastation and still move forward with dignity. You can feel fear so loud it fills your entire chest, and still walk directly through it. That is not suppression. That is mastery. That is the difference between a person who is lived by their emotions and a person who has learned to live alongside them. Point 4. The version of you that people know is already outdated. The people closest to you have a version of you saved in their memory, a fixed image, a collected archive of every time you reacted a certain way, said a certain thing, made a certain choice. And without realizing it, they relate to that archived version constantly. They expect you to respond how you always responded. They anticipate the patterns. They finish your sentences with the you they already decided you were. And the most suffocating thing about genuine transformation is that the people who love you most are often the ones most resistant to seeing it, because your change disturbs the role you played in their story. But here is what is more dangerous than their fixed image of you, your own fixed image of yourself. The way you disqualify your own growth because it doesn't match the person you were 2 years ago. The way you self-sabotage the moment you get close to becoming someone unfamiliar, even when that someone is healthier, freer, more aligned with what you actually want. You pull back. You return to old patterns, not because they serve you, but because they are known. And the human nervous system will choose familiar pain over unfamiliar peace almost every single time. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, built an entire philosophy on one radical premise, that virtue, not circumstance, determines the quality of a human life. Not what happened to you, not what people believe about you, not even what you believed about yourself yesterday. What you choose, repeatedly, consciously, in full awareness, that is what builds a life worth living. And that choosing can begin at any moment, including this one. The version of you that exists in other people's expectations is a photograph, still, fixed, already behind the reality of who you are becoming. You are not obligated to keep posing for it. You are not required to walk back into the frame they built for you just because standing outside it makes them uncomfortable. Their discomfort with your growth is not evidence that your growth is wrong. It is evidence that real change is visible, that it disrupts, that it cannot be hidden or performed. It simply is. Stop apologizing for outgrowing the person they needed you to stay. Point 5. You have been living someone else's definition of enough. At some point in your life, without any formal announcement, without any conscious agreement, you absorbed a standard, a measurement, a definition of what enough looks like: enough success, enough intelligence, enough discipline, enough worth, and you have been holding yourself against that measurement ever since, exhausting yourself chasing it, punishing yourself for falling short of it, quietly celebrating the rare moments you seem to meet it, only to watch the bar move again immediately after. And the devastating part is that you never once stopped to ask where that standard came from, who built it, whether it was ever actually yours. It came from a parent who expressed love through achievement. It came from a culture that assigns human worth to productivity. It came from a comparison made in childhood that you were never supposed to carry into adulthood, but somehow never put down. It came from a religion, a classroom, a relationship, a social media feed that monetizes your insecurity by keeping you permanently convinced that who you are right now is not quite enough to deserve the life you want. And you internalized all of it so deeply that you now enforce that standard on yourself more ruthlessly than any external critic ever could. Marcus Aurelius, a man who commanded the most powerful empire on earth, who had every external reason to measure his worth through power and legacy, returned to his journal night after night, not to record his victories, but to remind himself of something the world kept trying to make him forget. He wrote, "Confine yourself to the present, not the present of achievement, not the present of comparison, the present of simply being a conscious human being, doing the work of becoming more aligned, more honest, more intentional." That was enough for him, an emperor, and it is enough for you. You have spent years being the most brutal critic in your own life, replaying conversations where you said the wrong thing, reconstructing decisions where you chose the wrong path, measuring your current self against a future version that exists only in your imagination, and finding yourself permanently lacking. That inner courtroom has been in session for years, and you have never once ruled in your own favor. You prosecute every flaw with devastating precision and dismiss every strength as luck, circumstance, or something anyone could have done. That courtroom is not justice. That courtroom is self-destruction, dressed in the language of self-improvement. The Stoic path does not ask you to become perfect. It asks you to become conscious, to stop performing a version of yourself built from borrowed definitions of worth and begin living from your own examined values. To stop running a race whose finish line was drawn by someone who never understood your terrain. Your enough is not their enough. Your path does not follow their map. And the moment you stop measuring your interior life against an exterior standard that was never designed for you, something opens up. Not overnight, not dramatically, but genuinely, permanently, like a room you've been locked out of your entire life, finally unlocking from the inside. You were never behind. You were never less than. You were simply living inside the wrong definition of yourself. And definitions, unlike destiny, can be rewritten. So let's go back to where we started. You're not who you think you are. But now you understand why. You are not your survival patterns. You are not the opinions that were pressed into you during your most vulnerable moments. You are not the emotions that move through you like weather. You are not the outdated image that lives in other people's memories, or your own. And you are absolutely not the borrowed definition of enough that has been quietly running your decisions, your relationships, and your self-worth for longer than you can remember. What you are, underneath all of that, is something the Stoics pointed at but never fully named, because it doesn't fit inside language cleanly. You are the one who can observe all of it. The thoughts, the patterns, the fears, the performances. You are the awareness behind the noise. And awareness, once genuinely activated, cannot be put back to sleep. It changes the way you move through every room, every relationship, every moment of pressure where the old version of you would have collapsed back into familiar patterns and called it fate. Stoicism is not about becoming cold. It is not about suppressing your humanity. It is about becoming so deeply acquainted with your own interior landscape that nothing outside of you can permanently define you again. It is about building an identity from the inside out, from values, from examined beliefs, from conscious repeated choice, rather than inheriting one from fear and circumstance and other people's limitations. You watched this entire video. Something in you recognized itself here. Don't let that recognition become just another feeling that passes. Let it become a decision. The decision to stop living as the person your past created and start living as the person your awareness is now capable of building. That person has always been real. They were just buried under everything you were told to be. Drop this right now. I rebuild myself.